live.
Okay, great. Okay, folks, I think it's probably time to begin. So welcome everyone. Welcome to another International Manifesto Group webinar. This one, as you know, is on the Paris Commune and its revolutionary significance today. And it has been sponsored by, co-sponsored by Midwestern Marx. We're holding this webinar on one day after the 152nd anniversary of the start of the Commune. And I might add, we're doing it at a time when once again the workers of Paris are up in arms and the situation is very tense, as you know, in Paris. My name is Radhika Desai. I'm the convener of the International Manifesto Group. And I thought I would just start us off by listing about 4 reasons that I could think of why it's critically important for us to understand from a historical point of view, and also in terms of its contemporary significance, what the Paris Commune was about. Well, first of all, most simply, the Commune was, in Marx's words, essentially a working class government. The first instance of such a government. It was, he said, the produce of the struggle of the producing against the appropriating class, the political form at last discovered under which to work out the economical emancipation of labor. And that is why Marx devoted one of his most important works, The Civil War in France, to this event, examining it primarily for its importance as a form of transition from capitalism to socialism. Secondly, it was, as Engels said in his introduction of 1891, an instance of what the communist movement likes to term the dictatorship of the proletariat. He said, do you want to know what the dictatorship of the proletariat looks like? Look at the Paris Commune. That was the dictatorship of the proletariat. Thirdly, and precisely because it was so centrally important, Lenin devoted vast swathes of his State and Revolution to this event, and to Marx and Engels' analysis of the event. State and Revolution was written between the February and October revolutions of 1917. In this text, Lenin had clearly intended to update what he considered the best understanding of the stakes in and the challenges of the transformation of today's capitalist and imperialist states into worker states, embarking on a transition to socialism. And this text therefore included reflection on the still fresh February Revolution. But just before he got to that, he was actually interrupted, ironically, by the October Revolution and its consequences, which of course put Lenin in charge of the first successful communist revolution. That the manuscript broke off just when he was ready to tackle the experience after summing up the inherited wisdom is ironic, tragic, and perhaps, given the huge challenges of intellectually digesting an experience so recent, and one in which Lenin had been such a central protagonist, of course, very telling. Finally, and the fourth reason, and this is perhaps particularly relevant for us today, precisely because the experience of the Paris Commune is so critically important, it has been the special target of distortion, not only by mainstream scholars whose anti-communism is on open display, but also by all too many scholars. I'm thinking of people like Zizek and Badiou and people like that, who claim that they are socialists and even communists and Marxists, but who actually distort the real historical lessons that Marx and Engels wish to draw. Whether they do it out of ignorance and general intellectual incapacity, or because they are duplicitously acting to preserve the capitalist and imperialist status quo, does not matter, and the two reasons are often hopelessly mixed up in any case. But it is important that such distortions are there, out there, and they are there to mislead so many of us, because they typically see the central concept of the dictatorship of the proletariat through a liberal state versus market or state versus civil society dichotomy, when in fact they should be looking at the character of the state. And they also also tend to interpret the Marxist notion of the withering away of the state in terms of petty bourgeois, vulgar petty bourgeois anti-statism. So for all these reasons, we decided that we would organize this webinar on this critically important historical event that was the Paris Commune, to understand its significance for revolutions and revolutionaries today. And given that we have amongst us Ken Hammond, who is a historian distinguished for his work on revolutionary and pre-revolutionary China, the most powerful communist country in the world today, and for his understanding of the revolutionary tradition before and since, we decided to alter our format a little bit and take advantage of Ken's great learning on the topic today. So what we've decided is that he will speak for about 40 minutes, and then he'll be followed by brief remarks, about 10 to 15 minutes, depending on how long they need, by Keith Bennett and Carlos Garrido. And then we will have questions and answers. So I will introduce the three speakers as we go along. So let me start by introducing Ken Hammond. Ken, of course, is the author of many books and, of course, loads of articles on China and more generally on the revolutionary tradition. He's professor of East Asian and Global History at New Mexico State University and a member of Pivot to Peace and the Party for Socialism and Liberation. So Ken, the floor is yours. Please go ahead.
Thanks so much, Radhika. It's a pleasure to be here this morning. And we are the day after the anniversary of the founding of the Commune, but in some ways that's kind of appropriate because this would have been the first day when the proletariat of Paris, got up and embraced a new revolutionary moment, a new moment of empowerment, a new moment of adventure, experimentation, launching into a world that had not previously, been even possible to think of. What I want to do in the time that I have here is a few things. I'm going to start. I know it's probably a little bit, redundant for this audience, but I want to start by reviewing just a little bit about the Commune itself, the historical experience of the Commune. And then I want to think a little bit about the way in which the Commune has been understood, perceived, appreciated, particularly, of course, by Lenin, and from my own work in China, because the Paris Commune has served as a great inspiration, as a great source of experience and insight, both in the sense of its achievements and also in the sense of its challenges and the things which of course, as we all know, brought it down. This was not, the proletariat of Paris did not create the socialist society of the future that we all work for and aim for. And so we need to think about what are the lessons that we can draw from this historical experience. So the context, of course, for the Paris Commune was the war that took place between France and Prussia, the newly unifying force in Germany, that breaks out in September of 1870. And that war does not go well for France. The French government under Louis-Auguste Thiers thought that they were going to teach the Prussians a lesson, and instead things turned out really rather differently. The French army was humiliated by the Prussians. The French leadership, even Louis-Auguste Thiers himself, and the leaders of the French government were humiliated. And in a very short time, Prussian armies came into France and threatened the very occupation of the city of Paris itself. That's sort of the background that sets up this moment in the spring of 1871. the French government, the bourgeois government of the Republic, and it's important to understand that right away on the 4th of September of 1870, a republic was established in France, a republic which, as Marx talks about, was embraced by the working people, and for a while there was this hope of a path forward. But instead, under the leadership of these bourgeois politicians, it turned into a capitulationist regime, and they were on the verge, basically, of surrendering Paris to the Prussians. But the people of Paris revolted against that. They decided that was not an acceptable path. When the bourgeois government attempted to seize the armaments of the National Guard, and the National Guard in Paris was really the working class, the armed working class in many ways. And when they attempted to seize the armaments of the National Guard, this is the moment when the National Guard revolts, and the people of Paris, the working people of Paris, rise up in solidarity with the National Guard. They drive the bourgeois politicians and the military out of the city, and over about another week, between the 18th of March, 1871, and the 26th of March, there's a very chaotic period where everybody's trying to figure out basically what's going to happen. What are they going to do? On the 26th of March, 1871, an election was held, a general election was held in Paris to constitute a new revolutionary government of the city, of the Commune. And the hope was, the inspiration was, that this would become the model, the template that would be embraced across the country. And in fact, that does happen in a number of other places around France. But what happens in Paris is that a commune is elected, and it's elected by a very expansive franchise, a general franchise, although it's a franchise of men. Women did not vote in the election of the 26th of March. But things were certainly moving in that direction, and the women of Paris played a very prominent and very revolutionary role in the creation and the functioning of the commune. But the commune is established by this general referendum. This general election takes place on the 26th of March. When Marx writes about this in the Civil War in France, this is a moment where he criticizes, actually, the commune, because he says what they should have done right away was to march on Versailles, where the bourgeois government was basically on the ropes. And they didn't do that. They devoted themselves to trying to address the situation in Paris, trying to deal with the very, very significant and severe needs of the working people of Paris. The Paris Commune was a political organization, a political experiment of the working class. It was the proletariat of Paris that were the key players, the key component of this. Initially, when the Commune first is elected, petty bourgeois elements, even sort of national patriotic bourgeois elements join in. It is a broad coalition to begin with, but as the weeks go by, many of those non-proletarian elements sort of fall away. And really, the essence of the commune is its proletarian nature. And that's something that we need to see very, very clearly when we think about the historical experience and its relevance to our own times. Marx, in his writings about the commune, sets out a very clear set of the achievements, the accomplishments, the things that the commune set out to do, many of which they actually implemented. Others were on the agenda but could not be implemented because of the conflicts, the struggle simply to survive, which the commune faced. The commune was a a new form of political organization. And Marx was very clear that when the proletariat goes to seize power, it cannot simply take over the existing instruments of government. It can't simply inherit, in a sense, the state as it was constituted, because the bourgeois state was created, had evolved, had been developed to pursue the interests of a class. And now a different class was going to be in the position of political authority. So the Commune diverged from anything that had previously existed. It united the executive and the legislative powers. It mandated that service in the government, service of the Commune, was not something that was going to be, I don't know, a political career or something that would enrich the people who occupied offices. The officials of the Commune, the people who held political responsibility in the Commune, were to be paid workingmen's wages. The Commune set about transforming the social and political life of Paris. And we have to, when we think back on this, we have to understand exactly what it was they were dealing with. One of the major achievements, major endeavors of the Commune was to separate the church and the state. And we need to understand that in 1878, in the spring of 1871, the Catholic Church still had held tremendous political power in France and in Paris. So this idea of the separation of the church and state, many of us think of that as sort of a straightforward, simplistic thing, but it's not. This was a major undertaking of the Commune to secularize education, to disestablish, in a sense, the church, because the church and the state had been so closely interconnected. There was a question of the judiciary. The Commune, went for the election of judges, that the judiciary should be responsible to the people. Of course, one of the key elements in the establishment of the Commune was the idea of the imperative mandate, the idea that the officials of the Commune were not people who were chosen, as Marx says, in an election where every 3 or 6 years the people chose what bourgeois element would represent them or so-called represent them. But instead, that people would be elected by the people, individuals would be elected by the people to do particular tasks. And when those tasks were accomplished, when those tasks were completed, then their duties, their responsibilities would come to an end. And that if they were not accomplishing the things for which they were elected, they could be recalled. This idea of the recall, the imperative mandate and the recall. These were things that were unheard of previously. The idea of popular sovereignty, not in some abstract sense of representation, but in a very concrete sense of the implementation of the popular will, the needs, the interests, the imperatives of the working class. The Commune set about labor legislation. When we read about this, again, it's the sort of thing where you read these measures and you think, oh my God, that's so simple and straightforward. But abolishing, for example, overnight work for journeyman bakers. Okay, it seems kind of like a minor thing, but it was a major innovation at the time. The idea that legislation, that regulation by the state would be something that was exercised on behalf of working people, not in order to most effectively exploit their labor and extract value from their labor, but to actually protect their interests, to take care of them, to make sure that they were not being completely suppressed and exploited. So the Commune is a new moment. It's a moment different from anything that had gone before. Now, as Marx writes about the Commune, and indeed as later commentators write about it, the fundamental reality was that from the first day, from the moment that the Commune was proclaimed, they were on the defensive. The bourgeois government under Thiers set about trying to, what triggers the establishment of the commune is the efforts by that bourgeois government to take away the power of the people of Paris, to take away the arms of the National Guard. That gets derailed, but that doesn't mean that the bourgeoisie is going to sit back and say, oh, this is fine. So they face an onslaught of power from the national government, if you will, a national government, a rump government, a government of France, which has already lies prostrate before the Prussian armies. And they mobilize the resources that they have. And indeed, the Prussians release their prisoners of war, more than 100,000, to come back and join the army trying to suppress the commune. What's amazing is how long the commune is actually able to sustain itself, because they face daily attacks, daily assaults from the bourgeois government. One of the key measures of the commune that plays out while these attacks by the bourgeois government are taking place was the confiscation, the nationalization, if you will, of abandoned factories and workshops. And this is one of the key elements in the social program, the political program, the social program of the commune, because the idea was that productive facilities, productive capabilities, which had been given up by their owners, by the exploiters of labor, were lying unused, were lying fallow, if you will. And the commune set about taking over those facilities and empowering workers to bring those back into production, so that resources, economic resources, the wealth that the working class creates every day could be expanded, could be enhanced. Those efforts faltered, those efforts could never be fully implemented, but that's really one of the key initiatives, one of the key enterprises, if you will, that the commune pursued. And maybe the final thing that I'll just say about the actual practice of the commune was that, these days we hear a lot about the idea of transparency, the idea that political processes should be open, to the people who are affected by them. The commune published every day its proceedings, right? The commune was not a government that was put in place in an election and then it went about and did its business, and people could just wait for the next time that they could have a chance to vote. The commune was deeply, deeply integrated into the lives of the working people of Paris. And they published their proceedings, they published the transcripts of their meetings, of the decisions that they made. This was a moment of engagement. And I think that's the most important thing, that the working class cannot simply, as I already said, cannot simply take over the existing instruments of the government, but it has to reshape them, it has to recreate them in ways that draw in, that engage and empower the activism and the ideas, the ideals and the dreams and the goals and objectives of working class power. But as we know, the reality was that over the period between the 18th of March and the 28th of May, the commune was always on the defensive. It was always resisting the power of the bourgeois state. That power grew and grew. The bourgeoisie, they had the ascendancy. And eventually, by the week of the 21st to the 28th of May, this was the final showdown. This was the massacre that drove the commune out of existence. 30,000 or so people were killed outright. 45,000 people were arrested, many of whom faced execution while in custody. Many others fled into exile, who, if they were able to escape from Paris. The suppression of the commune, was one of the great crimes of history. But the legacy of the commune, the lessons to be learned from the commune, those are what remained with us. And of course, we all know that Marx, the International had written a couple of addresses about the Franco-Prussian War, and then Marx wrote the Civil War in France to sum up his understanding and his analysis of the lessons to be learned from the commune. And he was very clear-eyed about it. He saw it as this amazing, exhilarating social experiment, but he also recognized that it was, in a sense, sort of doomed from the start because of the material conditions, because of the political realities that even the empowered proletariat of Paris faced. That it was always going to be militarily the losers, militarily the weaker side, that all the things they did, and they accomplished these great experiments, these great innovations, they set a pattern, they laid down a template that later people could build on, but that the commune, made mistakes. He doesn't valorize it. He doesn't lionize the commune. He talks about the mistakes they made, not marching on Versailles, not building up the military power to try to resist. Basically, one of the lessons, and Lenin talks about this, I'll talk about that in just a moment, the commune was the armed proletariat. The commune was not a government that had an army of its own, that had a little special body of armed men, but it was the working class empowered. And so, on the one hand, that was a great accomplishment. That was a great step forward, but it also meant that the organization of resistance faced some limitations and faced some weaknesses. And ultimately, of course, that's what was overcome. In 1911, on the 40th anniversary of the commune, Lenin wrote an essay. And in that, he set out, I think, what are some very important lessons. He talked about the idea that for the victory of the social revolution, there were two essential conditions, two conditions that were necessary. One was the high development of productive forces, the idea that the economy had already reached a high level of productive capability. The other had to do with the preparedness of the proletariat to seize power. And Lenin casts a very stark judgment. He says neither of these was present in 1871. He talks about the achievements of the Paris Commune, goes over a lot of what we've already talked about here. He lays out the empowerment of the working class, the idea, he's very clear on the idea that at first, petty bourgeois and even patriotic bourgeois elements supported the commune, but that as the struggle went forward, many of those elements fell to the side. And ultimately, the commune was essentially and purely a proletarian endeavor. That's a wonderful thing, but it also meant that because the proletariat of Paris, was kind of making it up as it went along, this was an initial experiment, and it was overwhelmed by the power of the bourgeois state in France. The working class of Paris, the working class of France, was still not at a sufficient level of political development, political awareness to allow the commune to achieve the things that it needed to achieve in order to survive. I think realistically, it's hard to imagine how the proletariat of a single city in the context of late 19th century Europe could have prevailed. It's an existential endeavor in some ways. Lenin talks about the suppression of the commune, but then at the end of his essay, and of course, Lenin writes about the commune in many different contexts, but in this wonderful essay on the 40th anniversary, he emphasizes something that I think is really important about the Commune, which is that it was not simply something that belonged to the working class of Paris. It's not just about revolution in this city, revolution by these people, but that it had become an inspiration. The Paris Commune was the inheritance, the legacy, the inspiration of working people everywhere in the world, that people could draw on the lessons of the Commune, could feel the strength, the power, the energy of those workers in ways that could drive their own revolutionary movements forward. And of course, 1911 in Russia, this was not a great moment. This was not a moment when the working class was on the verge of seizing power. This was a moment where people were kind of hunkering down for the long haul. And yet what Lenin says is, we look back to the Commune, we see what they accomplished, we see the dreams, the hopes, the vision of a future, a just and equitable future for the proletariat. We see that and we draw inspiration from that. We understand that it failed, it was defeated, it was crushed, but we draw inspiration from it. Now, for me, I'm a historian of China. I began to be really engaged in my own political activism back in the 1960s. And part of that was hearing about, even through the distortions of the bourgeois media, hearing about the revolution in China, hearing about the Cultural Revolution in China. And one of the things that I heard at that time, 1966, 1967, was the idea that in China, a country on the other side of the planet, a country in many ways, so different, so far away, that the legacy of the Paris Commune had this incredible inspirational power. So the last few things I want to say here are to just reflect on the experience of China and a little bit about the legacy of all this for our moment today. The Paris Commune was a subject of study in China. It was a subject that people wrote about and talked about. In 1963, a comrade named Li Shu wrote an essay on the lessons of the Paris Commune. And what Li Shu said was that for China, for the revolutionary path of China, the Paris Commune was just as important as the lessons of the Russian Revolution. China, of course, through the 50s and even to some extent into the early 60s, had a very close relationship with the Soviet Union. The inspiration of Lenin and the Bolshevik Revolution was very powerful in China. But Li Shu writes about Paris and this idea of the direct empowerment of the working class as something that was relevant, was meaningful, that Chinese revolutionaries, the party, the people should pay attention to. It's interesting. Chairman Mao wrote about the Commune a number of times. He mentions it in a number of writings all the way back in the 1950s. But in general, for a while, he was rather critical of the Commune, what were the historical lessons to be drawn from the Commune. And he emphasized in his writings in the 50s and even in the early 60s, the challenges, the problems that the Commune faced. But as Mao himself and others in China became increasingly concerned about the questions of bureaucratization and the challenges of keeping the revolution and the leadership of the revolution embodied in the Communist Party in a live, dynamic relationship with the people, Commune began to take on greater significance. In March of 1966, when the Cultural Revolution was revving up, a comrade named Zheng Jiesu on the 95th anniversary of the Paris Commune, wrote an essay, Great Lessons of the Paris Commune, in which he emphasized these ideas of direct proletarian democracy, the idea that the commune seized power and didn't simply set up a new representative government, a new government that was elected and then went about its business, but instead upheld the ideal of a government that was directly connected, was deeply engaged on a day-to-day basis with the needs and the interests and the participation of the people, of the working class. These ideas found a lot of resonance in the turbulence of 1966. In August of 1966, there was an editorial published that was in a number of venues, most particularly in Hongqi, Red Flag, the ideological journal of the party, called The General Election System of the Paris Commune. And it was a study of the idea that the commune was elected, by a broad franchise. And again, not embracing, women voting, but a universal franchise of men. And that it could serve as a model of participation, of engagement, not in the sense of, here's my vote, you go about your business, I'll see you in 4 years, but of, here's the mandate, here's what you need to do, here's the tasks that we face, let's get them done. Also in August of 66, of course, Chairman Mao, as the Cultural Revolution was revving up, wrote his big character poster, his Dazabao, at Beijing University, Peking University. And in that, he explicitly invoked the image of the Paris Commune. He said that what they were doing, what the Cultural Revolution was attempting to do, was to create a new Paris Commune for the 1960s, for the present moment. Other leaders, Chen Boda, who was one of the great ideological thinkers at that point in the Cultural Revolution, wrote extensive essays about the Paris Commune. This model, this ideal, was studied all over the country. People engaged in, they read the Civil War in France, they read Lissaguetti's history of the Commune that was translated into Chinese at that time. And the energy of this built bit by bit through the fall of 66 and into the new year of 1967. On the 31st of January of 1967, there was an editorial again published in the People's Daily and in a few other outlets, holding high this banner of the Paris Commune. And of course, what happens just a week later was the establishment of a commune in Shanghai. The Shanghai Commune doesn't get, I think, the attention that it deserves, because this was a moment that I don't think has come again since then, when mass organizations in in Shanghai, mass organizations in Shanghai, organizations of workers from the factories, from the docks, from the rail yards, 2 million people marched to the center of the city and proclaimed the establishment of a direct proletarian democracy. They set up what they called a new Paris Commune. When the commune, the Shanghai Commune, was elected on the 6th of February, 1967, they explicitly said this is a new Paris Commune. So the image, the lessons, the inspiration of the communes was directly invoked at that point. Now, the Shanghai Commune lasted much less time than the Paris Commune did, only a few weeks. It was disbanded at the end of February, and new forms of political organization came into being, what were called the revolutionary committees, the 3-in-1 combination, the party, the army, and the masses. that's a whole downstream process, and we don't need to go through all of that at this point. I think many of us are familiar with that itself. But that doesn't mean that the inspiration of the Paris Commune disappeared. In 1971, on the centenary of the Commune, in the People's Republic, there was a reissue of the collected texts, the collected writings about the Commune, editorials in the major papers talking about defending the principles of the Paris Commune. These ideals persisted, and in many ways, they're still there in China today. You know, we can, at some other point, talk about the particularities of the Chinese Revolution today, their long and ongoing quest for building a socialist future. But the inspiration of the Paris Commune, the lessons of the Paris Commune, they're not lost, they're not forgotten. So, you know, we have Marx, we have Lenin, we have China. These analyses, these attempts to draw the lessons, to understand what happened, why, how great it was, but also what the problems were, what the shortcomings were, how it did not succeed, obviously. So what does this have to do with us today? You know, here we are, 2023. We find ourselves, oh my God, in a deepening crisis. Well, in a number of deepening crises, you know, here in the United States, where I am, in Europe, other parts of the world, we are in a moment of great transition. We're in a moment of the decline, but not yet the fall, of American imperialism, of Western imperialism, a system of global dominance that has persisted through the 19th and 20th centuries is on the way out. But this, like the situation in France in the spring of 1871, it's a moment of promise and a moment of tremendous danger. And it's a moment when the power, and it's an unbelievable power, of the working class needs to be mobilized, needs to be awakened, because that's the only path which will take us forward. It's the only path which will see off the imperialist order, which will help us in the struggle to preserve life on the planet, and which, in a more immediate and concrete way, may help us to avoid a third world war, a terrible conflagration that would destroy billions of us, right? We face a moment of deep existential crisis. And I know for me, and I think for probably everybody who's here now, when we think about the Paris Commune, we think about stepping up, you know, about seizing the moment, about saying, we're going to try and make a difference. We're going to try and build a better world, a world that is just, that is equitable, a world where the wealth that we produce is shared among us and not siphoned off, you know, to the yachts and the indulgences of the bourgeoisie. It is possible. It's a long and winding road, but we can look back at our history and say, this can be done. Okay, thank you. That's what I have to say.
That's really a great note to end on, and your very informative talk on, Ken, particularly sort of as a reminder that maybe, you know, the European working classes can finally acquit themselves by stopping a war now, which they didn't earlier. So that's, you know, an important line. We now have two shorter commentaries, and I think we'll start with Carlos. Carlos, is that okay? We'll start with you. Let me just introduce Carlos Garrido. Carlos is a Cuban-American PhD student, instructor in philosophy at Southern Illinois University at Carbondale. He has an MA in philosophy from the same institution. And Carlos also does a lot of other things. He's an editor at the Midwestern Marx Institute, which is a co-sponsor of this program. And please check out their website. They have lots of interesting things going on there. And also editor of the Journal of American Socialist Studies. Carlos is the author of a book that's about to come out. It's called The Purity Fetish and the Crisis of Western Marxism. He has also edited and introduced a really important work called Marxism and the Dialectical Materialist Worldview, an anthology of classical Marxist texts on dialectical materialism. He also writes very extensively in popular and scholarly modes, usually on topics related to Marxist theory, US socialist history, and global struggles against imperialism. So, Carlos, please go ahead. You have about 10 minutes, but yeah, slightly flexible 10 minutes if you need it. And I should say very quickly for those who entered late that after Carlos and Keith have spoken, we'll have questions and answers and a broader discussion with everyone. Okay, go ahead, Carlos.
Well, first, thank you, Radhika and the IMG. I'm honored to be here and to give some of my thoughts on that heroic event from 152 years ago. And thank you, Professor Hammond, for such a wonderful presentation. There are three central points that I would like to emphasize in my talk. The first concerns the worldview through which Marx and Engels study the Commune. The second, the relevance of their conclusions. And the third, the new lessons we may draw from the many communes we've had since the dawn of the 20th century. So the first, as I'm sure most of you know, 6 months before the communards would officially be at war with the French government, Marx would say that any attempt at upsetting the new government in the present crisis would be a desperate folly. As time passed and the antagonism between the bourgeois government and the Parisian workers intensified, culminating in open war by March 18th, and in the proclamation of the Commune the week after, Marx's attitude completely changed. Far from considering what they were doing to be a desperate folly, he would say, what resilience, what historical initiative, what a capacity for sacrifice in these Parisians. They were storming the heavens, and history has no like example of such greatness. I think the meaning of this transformation is often overlooked. Emphasis is usually laid on the conclusions Marx and Engels derived from the Commune. However, I think that it is in analyzing this transition where we understand the essence of Marxism, that is, the worldview through which we approach reality. Only in doing this can we ourselves do with the many socialist experiments of the 20th and 21st century, what Marx and Engels did with the Commune. So what deeper meaning lay in this transition from skeptic to ardent supporter? Quite simply, the fact that Marx and Engels were not concerned with having material reality measure up to an ideal in their heads. They studied, unlike the Western Marxists, the real movement of history which abolishes the present state of things. They were concerned with the dialectical development of people's struggles, with drawing lessons from these and adjusting their theoretical understanding in accordance with the forms the struggles in the real world discovered. The Paris Commune was not pure. It contained ideological deviations from Marxism, and to a certain extent, it could be said that its key ideological orientation was Blanquist and Proudhonist. However, this never stopped Marx and Engels from supporting and learning from their revolutionary efforts. In complete contrast to this dialectical materialist worldview, which prioritizes the material world and observes it in its development, contradictions, and interconnections with everything else, the Western Marxists have, over the last century, used the purity fetish outlook to approach the socialist experiments which have arisen and abolished in various forms the present state of things. They have consistently produced nothing but petty criticisms of real socialist experiments, condemning reality because it fails to measure up to the ideal which they call socialism in their heads. Few things are more common than seeing Western Marxists start their books and articles with condemnations of socialism in the USSR, China, Cuba, the DPRK, and others as authoritarian, Stalinist, state capitalist, or my personal favorite because of its paradoxical character, not real socialism. Those things which they consider to be failures in these projects are magnified, decontextualized, and synecdochally painted as the whole experience. Samir Amin put it nicely in respect to China when he said that China bashing panders to the infantile opinion found in some currents of the powerless Western left. If it is not the communism of the 23rd century, it is a betrayal. It is clear that the truth of this statement spans well beyond just China. It is grounded in the purity fetish outlook, a form of engagement with the world which couldn't be any farther from Marx and Engels' dialectical materialist worldview. If we are to celebrate, as we are, the Paris Commune by reflecting on the relevance of Marx and Engels' insights on it, without a doubt, the question of the worldview through which they approach the world is of utmost importance. Without this, their genuine insights are merely dead conclusions, severed from the form of thinking which would allow us to do today what Marx and Engels did 152 years ago, namely, learn from the dialectical movement of the working masses towards freedom. My second point. In emphasizing the worldview behind Marx and Engels' assessments of the Commune, I am not saying that the conclusions drawn are unimportant or outdated. Both the worldview and the conclusions must be seen in light of each other, and each in light of their context. The fundamental lesson of the Commune, however, remains today as relevant and true than ever. In the preface to the 1872 German edition of the Manifesto, Marx and Engels would make only one correction to that historical document explicit. They would say, one thing especially was proved by the Commune, namely, that the working class cannot simply lay hold of the ready-made state machinery and wield it for its own purpose. It was not simply the case that the modern state was a committee for managing the common affairs of the whole bourgeoisie, but also that the state institutions through which this aim was achieved, that is the standing army, police, bureaucracy, clergy, judicature, and so on, were designed precisely for the sake of this function. The proletariat cannot successfully wield state power through state institutions crafted to keep labor subordinate to capital. For the proletariat, as the manifesto urges, to be organized as the ruling class, it needed to smash the existing bourgeois state and replace it with working class institutions of a fundamentally different order. The Commune showed that the state had to be transformed from being a special force for the suppression of a particular class to the suppression of the oppressors by the general force of the majority of the people, the workers and the peasants. Hence, Marx says that Paris could only resist because the first decree of the Commune was the suppression of the standing army and the substitution for it of the armed people. Similar qualitative transformations occurred in the Commune's treatments of public officials, suffrage, education, judicature, and so on, in each case destroying the state as the parasitic excrescence which represses labor for the sake of capital, and putting in its place a genuinely democratic working class state which would use the general force of society to repress the old exploiting classes and administer state functions in the interest of the mass of people. This is what the dictatorship of the proletariat as a higher form of socialist democracy entails. This lesson is more vital today in our neo-imperialist stage of capitalism, as Cheng and Fu labels it, than it was in 1871, and perhaps even more vital than it was in 1916 at the time of Lenin's major writings on imperialism. Today, any revolutionary process which sustains even the smallest space for bourgeois political parties and participation will be leaving the door open for imperialism's entry through its collaboration with the national bourgeoisie. We have seen this occur repeatedly since at least the overthrow of Allende's Chile in 1973. As of recent, we have seen this in Lula and Dilma's Brazil, in Ortega's Nicaragua, in Chavez and Maduro's Venezuela, and in Evo's Bolivia. In each of these experiments, the national bourgeoisie collaborated with imperialism to attempt to overthrow, sometimes successfully, sometimes not, the popular revolutions through various means, from lawfare coups to astroturf protests to presidential kidnappings. It is clear that insofar as the bourgeois state structure remains, even if under the control of a workers' or socialist party, a window will always be open for the national bourgeoisie to collaborate with imperialism in bringing forth what W.E.B. Du Bois called a counter-revolution of property. It is much more difficult to imagine a clownish figure like Guaido or a fascist figure as Jenny Agnès getting as far as they did under worker states like Cuba, China, Vietnam, and the DPRK. Why is this the case? Let us recall the categorical distinction Mao makes in 1957 between political and economic capital, while sustaining that economic capital does not necessarily have to be stripped all at once. That is, as Marx had already noted, that it can be wrested by degree in accordance with the role it plays in developing the productive forces for socialism. On the other hand, political capital, Mao would go on to say, must be deprived until not one jot is left to the capitalist. This is where revolutions like the Bolivarian, the Bolivian, the Nicaraguan, and others, for all their successes, have fallen somewhat short. They have not been able to fully expropriate the political capital of the bourgeoisie, and neither have they been able to, subsequently, complete the process of the proletarianization of the state, that is, of the construction of the dictatorship of the proletariat. This is not a condemnation. I am, like Marx and Engels were with the Commune, an ardent supporter of these emancipatory movements. I consider there to be a lot to learn from them. But as Marx and Engels had already noted with the Commune, in not going far enough in their use of the repressive apparatuses of the worker state, the door was left open for counter-revolution. As Engels wrote in 1872, would the Paris Commune have lasted even a single day if it had not made use of this authority of the armed people against the bourgeoisie? Should we not, on the contrary, reproach it for not having used it freely enough? These sentiments were repeated years later by Lenin, who said that the Commune, instead of destroying its enemies, it sought to exert moral influence over them, and in doing so ultimately gave Versailles time enough to gather its dark forces and prepare for the blood-soaked week of May. Without a doubt, these recent Latin American experiments in 21st century socialism have succeeded in making this transition in various areas. Who can forget, for example, the 8 Silver Corps mercenaries caught in 2020 by Venezuelan fishermen and Bolivarian militias in the coastal town of Choao? What a better example of the general force of the people taking up the role of repressing the enemies of the revolution. However, the threat presented by imperialist hybrid warfare, it seems to me at least, can be better averted as bourgeois state institutions are overcome and proletarian and popular ones are put in their place. My third point, as I'm sure I am quite short on time by now, I'd like to be quick with this one. It has been 152 years since the heroic effort of the communards. Since then, we have seen revolutionary movements erupt in virtually every country on the planet, some which have yet to grab power, some which grabbed power and then lost it, and others which still hold on to power. If we approach these experiments as Marx and Engels did the Commune, I think at least 2 key lessons can be drawn from them, both of which were already implicit in Marx and Engels, but become explicit in the experience of 20th and 21st century socialist movements. The first, it is imperative that after the conquest of political power, the development of the productive forces, the sciences and technologies, and the defense and securities of a country are emphasized. Without these developments, which are made increasingly difficult by the reality of imperialism and its global dominance over intellectual property, a socialist project will not be able to flourish. Without these developments, the global inequality between the looting imperialist powers and everyone else, or to use the despicable metaphor from EU Foreign Policy Chief Joseph Borrell, the inequalities between the garden and the jungle, will not be bridged, and the imperialist powers will maintain their global position unthreatened. The success of China, which stands today as the beacon of a new post-Columbian, in the sense of 1492, world, testifies to the immense importance of these developments in the battle against capitalist imperialism. In our age, after the experience of the Soviet new economic policy, of Yugoslavia's socialist market economy, and most importantly, of China's reform and opening up, where socialist markets have been developed and private ownership sustains a large yet auxiliary role in the development of the productive forces, we have learned that this development can take many forms, that it does not necessarily require, as Marx and Engels at times imply, the immediate and full-fledged expropriation of the expropriators. In some cases, such as Cuba, the full expropriation of the expropriators was of immediate necessity. In other cases, such as China, the development of socialism has always maintained, since the pre-49 liberated areas, a mixed economic form, where private property and markets exist as an auxiliary of the centrally planned state economy. Far from using cherry-picked comments from Marx and Engels to condemn these developments, we should do with them what they did with the Commune, that is, learn from them, see how these forms have become necessary for the real movement of history which abolishes the present state of things. My second point, in terms of the lessons that we've had from the post-Commune communes, dialectics in both Hegel and in Marxism rejects the traditional idea in philosophy of an abstract universal, of a thing that exists in the same form throughout space and time. Instead, it holds that universals are always concrete, that they take form or concretize themselves through the particular. What does this tell us about socialism? Well, simply that there could be no such thing as abstract socialism. Socialism is the universal which cannot exist unless concretized through the particular. In every country it has taken root in, socialism has had to adapt itself to the unique characteristics of the peoples which have waged and won the struggle for political power. In China, this has taken the form of socialism with Chinese characteristics. In Cuba, it has meant incorporating José Martí and the anti-colonial traditions into socialist construction. In Venezuela, this has taken the form of Bolivarian socialism, and so on and so forth. In each case, the struggle has been, as Georgy Dimitrov had already noted in 1935, national in form and socialist in content. In various parts of the US left, the purity fetish outlook has obscured this historical lesson and made rampant the phenomenon which Dimitrov called national nihilism. Our people's history is reduced to slavery, settler colonialism, imperialism, and all the evils of capital and the state. In doing so, they reject drawing from their national past to give form to socialist content. Far from the progressivism they see in this outlook, what these positions actually depict is a liberal tinted American exceptionalism, which thinks that the struggle for socialism in the US will itself not have to follow this concrete universal tendency seen around the world, where socialism functions, again, as the content which takes form according to the unique characteristics in which it is being developed. This has prevented the US left from genuinely learning from its progressive history and connecting with its people. A perfect example of this is the fact that from 1865 to the counter-revolution of 1876, in previous Southern slave states, Reconstruction developed a dictatorship of labor. This dictatorship was headed by the Black proletariat, who had been emancipated, who had emancipated itself from chattel slavery through a general strike, which won the Second American Revolutionary War. It's also called the Civil War. It was organized by the Freedmen's Bureau and defended militarily by the federal government. It was, in a sense, our Paris Commune, which started before and lasted longer than the original, and which, like the Commune, fell thanks to a counter-revolution of property. Besides the few on the US left, which take the work of the great Dr. Du Bois serious, this legendary experience of a new workers' democracy, not unlike the Commune, is largely erased and forgotten from our people's revolutionary history. Whether we consider the Paris Commune the first modern dictatorship of the proletariat or give that title to the Black proletariat during Reconstruction is somewhat irrelevant. What matters, in my view, is that the Paris Commune, as Lenin argued, by fighting for the freedom of toiling humanity, of all the downtrodden and oppressed, is still being honored 152 years after its fall by the proletariat of the whole world. That is why, in the words of Lenin, the cause of the Commune did not die. It lives to the present day in every one of us. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Carlos. That was great. I mean, you're practically suggesting that we should have another webinar on this upsurge between 65 and 76. That would be pretty brilliant. Our final speaker today is Keith Bennett. Keith is an active member of the International Manifesto Group, and I should add the editor of the IMG website and also the affiliated New Cold War website, which is our news and analysis website. He is a consultant specializing in Chinese and Korean affairs and has been a close observer and student of socialist development in Asia for half a century, and is currently co-editor of the Friends of Socialist China website and deputy chair of the Kim Jong-il Foundation, which is shortened as KKF. So Keith, we're very eager to hear from you.
Thanks very much, Radhika, and thanks for inviting me. Thank you to Ken for his wonderful and often very moving presentation, and also to Carlos. I'm not sure if it's a good thing to be the last speaker, particularly when you're followed by two such brilliant people, but nevertheless, that's the role that's been assigned to me today. Now, looking at, we've heard various things of what Marx had to say about the Commune, and I'm just going to start, therefore, with just one more at the moment, which is that Marx described the Commune as being, quote, the dawn of the great social revolution, which will liberate mankind from the regime of classes forever. And incidentally, following on from Ken's talk, I came actually in preparing for today, I came across that quote from a 1971 Paris Commune centenary article in the Peking Review, writing about how the Internationale came to be written and came to be the anthem of the international working class movement. However, in analysing what a workers' government might look like, basing themselves on the Paris Commune, Marx and Engels, in analysing what a workers' government might look like, Marx and Engels only had the Paris Commune to go on, brief and limited as that historical experience was, and they could only assess it from afar and not as direct participants. Marx himself never used the phrase dictatorship of the proletariat to describe the Commune. That designation fell to Engels when he posthumously published Marx's writings under the title The Civil War in France. And like any political statement, it can't be separated from its concrete context. It was, in this instance, it was Engels's increasing concern at the reformist drift of the Second International, and especially of its major component, the mass membership German SPD, that particularly occasioned this remark. And this can be seen from how Engels phrases that observation, which he does as follows. He says, "Of late, the social democratic Philistine has once more been filled with wholesome terror at the words dictatorship of the proletariat. Well and good, gentlemen, do you want to know what this dictatorship looks like? Look at the Paris Commune. That was the dictatorship of the proletariat." Marx, however, did note, and I think actually this has already been used today, that is the Paris Commune's true secret was this: it was essentially a working class government, the produce of the struggle of the producing against the appropriating class, the political form at last discovered, under which to work out the economic emancipation of labor. And for his part, Lenin observed, as Ken remarked, Lenin referred to the Commune on many occasions, and I'm going to give two brief quotations here. The first is from Lenin's article, "The Tasks of the Proletariat in Our Revolution," and the second is from the theses and report on bourgeois democracy and the dictatorship of the proletariat, given at the first Congress of the Communist International. In the first one, Lenin said that the Soviets, and quote, reproduced the type of state which was being evolved by the Paris Commune. And in the second remark to the first Congress of the Comintern, he says the Paris Commune made the first world historic step along this path, the Soviet power the second. Now, I would say that implicit in this is the idea that Soviet power constitutes a more advanced experience than the Paris Commune. In his recently published work on socialist governance, Professor Roland Bohr notes that the extreme democracy practiced by the Commune has led many Western Marxists to idealize it as the highest example and the template for working class power. And Bohr cites, among others in this regard, examples of Hal Draper and Ralph Miliband, amongst others. Marx, however, again indebted to Professor Bohr for this, observed that the Central Committee surrendered its power too soon to make way for the Commune. Lenin, for his part, and this is from a 1908 article of Lenin's entitled Lessons of the Commune, Lenin writes, although the socialist proletariat was split up into numerous sects, the Commune was a splendid example of the unanimity with which the proletariat was able to accomplish the democratic tasks which the bourgeoisie could only proclaim. Without any particularly complex legislation, in a simple, straightforward manner, the proletariat, which had seized power, carried out the democratization of the social system, abolished the bureaucracy, and made all official posts elective. However, he continues as follows: but two mistakes destroyed the fruits of the splendid victory. The proletariat stopped halfway. Instead of setting about expropriating the expropriators, it allowed itself to be led astray by dreams of establishing a higher justice in the country, united by a common national task. Such institutions as the banks, for example, were not taken over, and Proudhonist theories about a just exchange, etc., still prevailed among the socialists. The second mistake was excessive magnanimity on the part of the proletariat. Instead of destroying its enemies, it sought to exert moral influence on them. It underestimated the significance of direct military operations in civil war, and instead of launching a resolute offensive against Versailles that would have crowned its victory in Paris, it tarried and gave the Versailles government time to gather the dark forces and prepare for the blood-soaked week of May. For me, perhaps Marx's most succinct summation of the Paris Commune was made in 1871 and comes right at the start of the chapter on the Paris Commune in the Civil War in France, namely, and this has been alluded to already today, I think, by Radica and twice by Ken, this one sentence from Marx: "But the working class cannot simply lay hold of the ready-made state machinery and wield it for its own purposes." Now, like any statement, particularly any statement of Marx, Engels, or Lenin, this has to be assessed dialectically. First, I think it should be made clear that there are simply no examples of the working class assuming electoral office and going on to build socialism on that basis alone. Indeed, many parties of the working class movement, or at least nominally of the working class movement, actually had or have no intention of doing so. Although this is not to say that such governments are not capable of introducing progressive reforms favourable to working people. Nevertheless, the ways in which the working class and its allies have taken power have varied greatly, and they continue to do so. To take what to me is the most obvious example, the Chinese Revolution, which relied on the peasantry, built stable revolutionary base areas, waged protracted people's war, surrounded the cities from the countryside, and ultimately seized nationwide political power by armed force, was very different in form from the events of October or November, depending on your calendar, 1917 in Russia. However, what they clearly had in common was the smashing of the old state as a prerequisite for the assumption of power. But today we cannot ignore the unfolding developments, as Carlos has also spoken about, principally in Latin America, although I believe they find echoes elsewhere, for example in Nepal, where, in varying ways and with varying degrees of success to date, the working class is seeking to open a road to socialism that builds on electoral victory. In my view, it is too early to form a definitive judgment on this, but it can only be viewed from a standpoint of solidarity and support. Probably the most important single word in Marx's short sentence is simply. There is nothing here that is prescriptive in terms of how to take power and how to transform or to replace the state. What is most significant in terms of the unfolding political process in Latin America and elsewhere is precisely how the most advanced forces have, when the opportunity presents itself, and that is also an important consideration, as revolutionary opportunities cannot simply be willed into being, systematically attempted to repurpose and refound the state. This has taken the form of constituent assemblies to bypass and surpass old structures, the adoption of new constitutions, the creation of grassroots organs of popular power, and so on. Now, all this clearly goes beyond what even the best of radical social democracy has achieved or been able to achieve elsewhere, be that through the common program of the French Socialists under Mitterrand, together with the French Communist Party some decades back, or the experience of the Syriza government in Greece, the Corbyn project in Britain, and so on. But what has been most essential and fundamental in the most advanced examples of the transformation underway in Latin America has been to create people's armed forces in place of bourgeois armed forces, taking account of Engels' observation that the state is, in the final analysis, a body of armed men, and Mao Zedong's that political power grows out of the barrel of a gun. We see this most clearly in Venezuela and Nicaragua. In Venezuela, in no small part due to Hugo Chavez's own background in the armed forces, and in Nicaragua, where although the Sandinistas returned to power by winning an election and have continued to win elections, their power also rests on their initial seizure of state power following a long period of guerrilla struggle. What we see in essence is the unfolding of new types or variants of the dictatorship of the proletariat on the basis of the lessons learned starting from the Paris Commune. This is exactly, I believe, what Lenin foresaw and had in mind when he wrote in State and Revolution as follows. This is Lenin in State and Revolution. The essence of Marxist teaching on the state has been mastered only by those who understand that the dictatorship of a single class is necessary, not only for every class society in general, not only for the proletariat, which has overthrown the bourgeoisie, but also for the entire historical period which separates capitalism from classless society, from communism. The forms of bourgeois state, the forms of bourgeois states are extremely varied, but their essence is the same. All these states, whatever their form, in the final analysis, are inevitably the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. The transition from capitalism to communism certainly cannot but yield a tremendous abundance and variety of political forms, but the essence will inevitably be the same, the dictatorship of the proletariat. Now, as I believe it was Radhika already pointed out today, Lenin was actually writing State and Revolution prior to even the October Revolution. Yet even before the October Revolution, Lenin was able to grasp, at least in an overall general sense, that the dictatorship of the proletariat going forward would take a multiplicity of forms. In a March 1961 article for the 90th anniversary of the Commune, the Communist Party of China added to this formulation as follows: whatever forms the proletarian dictatorship takes, they all mean an extension of democracy and the transition from superficial bourgeois democracy to genuine democracy, i.e. the democracy of the working people. And I would like to just finish by quoting from that 90th anniversary commemorative article by the Communist Party of China, which was published in Hongqi, Red Flag, again the journal that Ken mentioned, where a Chinese comrade called Qi Tongshan wrote, "The Paris Commune lasted only 72 days. Although it met with defeat, the revolutionary spirit manifested by the proletariat in the struggle to found the Paris Commune is immortal. Its historic significance is tremendous and its experience extremely precious for the revolutionary movement of the proletariat of the whole world." Thank you.
Thanks so much, Keith. That was really great. And I don't think you had any fears of following on from anyone. I think those were amazing remarks, which I think also force us to think really about the real meaning of the term, the real movement of history, that communism is the real movement of history, and how both the successes and the failures of revolution testify to what history was capable of producing at that time. I think we can now open up for questions and answers. Those of you who have questions, please use the raise hand function, which you will find somewhere along the bottom of your Zoom screen. Mine is in a tab called Reactions, but you may have a independent raise hand function, because if you don't use that, I may not be able to see that. If you just do this, I may not be able to see that you have raised your hand. So please raise your hand as you have questions. And while we are waiting, I might also say to the panelists that if you have questions or comments on one another, please go ahead and raise your hands as well. Everyone is kind of perhaps stunned by these wonderful presentations. maybe I'll just start off by elaborating. Oh, well, okay, we have a question. I'll start with Richard first, and if necessary, I'll insert my question later. So please go ahead.
Yes, I'd like to hear our speakers or anyone else maybe talk a little bit more about what is often that fine line. I mean, there were some people noted the criticisms that people on the left often make of existing socialist projects and so on. And that gives comfort to people who are critical of the movement to socialism. And yet, within all of those movements, there were, as we've seen, mistakes made, things that could be done better. Could you speak a little bit about how we draw that line of having a critical perspective, like Marx and Engels and Lenin did, and yet being supportive of the progress that has been made without asking that, each movement, whether it's the Russian Revolution, the Chinese, Venezuela, or whatever, attains a perfect example for us, because that's not going to happen. It's a dialectical historical process. So if you could, give us the benefit of your own thinking about how do we maintain that balance and able to bring in people who are supportive of the movement to socialism, but may have some legitimate concerns about specific ideas within each of those examples.
Thanks, Richard. And I guess since my question is actually really so close to yours, I'll just very quickly and briefly put mine. I mean, the way I would put it is, at what point do you say that, there was a sort of failure of political will? And at what point would you say that, the conditions were not right? For example, if it was a fact that in the Paris Commune, there was a prevalence of certain Proudhonist notions, to what extent would you say that this was some sort of failure on the part of the proletariat? Remember, of course, that in those days, Marxist parties kind of didn't really exist in any great form. So to what extent and to what extent does it simply show that a lot more of history had to unfold before we could have the sort of communist consciousness and so on? So yeah, I just put that as a supplement to Richard's question, but please go ahead. Maybe Ken, shall we start with you?
Sure. I mean, this is the question that we face every day, in talking to people and going out in the world. And, my own work is obviously primarily around China. And it's in many ways very analogous to the way that Marx and others have looked back at the Commune, that we can see that there are tremendous achievements, but it's not an abstraction. It's not something that we sort of separate from reality. It's embedded in reality. It is reality, and reality is messy, and so when I talk to comrades or anybody about China, I generally the sort of term I use is critical support, that we support the work, we support the effort, the drive, the vision, the hope, the struggle, even when as we recognize that, it's human, it's dealing, what is it Marx says in the 18th Brumaire, people make their own history, but not in circumstances of their own choosing, often when I work with my undergrads, I say, the way I kind of simplify that. I say, people make their own history, but not from scratch. It's, you deal with the realities that you have to face. You got to play the cards you're dealt, whatever trope you want to invoke. So, I'm a big fan of China, and I think that the revolution there, the struggle for a socialist future, is an ongoing work in progress. But there are contradictions, there are problems, and it's not just in some sort of abstract theoretical model, in the concrete realities of life, because the revolution it's not like flipping a light switch. It's not like one day we have capitalism and the next day we have socialism. It is a long, arduous path of struggle. You know, Lenin talks about 2 steps forward, 1 step back. It's a dance. It's an ongoing effort. And so we support, we rally to the cause of every step forward. And when there are setbacks, when there are mistakes, when there are detours, however we want to think of it, we got to recognize that. We don't just gloss over that. We don't just say, oh, everything's fine. You know, we're just doing great. We recognize the problems, but we do so in a comradely and fraternal way. And when we talk about that to people who are kind of outside the ranks, if you will, I think it's really important to be frank and honest and straightforward and not try to portray what we're about and what we're doing as some heroic, march forward. This is a struggle. That's why we use that word. So I think that we need to be critical always, because we have a vision, we have an ideal that we seek, but to get there is a tortuous path sometimes, or I guess really all the time. And I just think we don't serve the mission, we don't serve the objective by pretending that it's just a smooth path. We have to navigate our way, and we have to be willing to acknowledge our own shortcomings and the shortcomings of other comrades and the challenges that we face. That's my thought.
Sure. Carlos and then Keith.
First, that's a monster of a question, by the way. It's what I asked myself before I was finalizing this presentation. It comes to mind, like, who am I? What have I done here in the States to build revolution, to stand and critique, regardless of how comradely, in my head at least, it is projects that have succeeded, that have lifted their people out of poverty, and that have done tremendous things for their people. So it is a very important question, and I think it's one that's hard for us within the belly of the beast to have this tendency to sometimes romanticize and to blur over certain contradictions that I think it would only be helpful if those are addressed. But there's a few points that I want to make, which is know your context. We're here amongst comrades. Don't be going to bourgeois media and giving a whole hour spiel about the particularities of the contradictions that you've been observing. The other thing is part of having to be a comradely critique is that also engage with the critiques that these revolutionary projects are giving of themselves. If you read the Cuban revolution's theorists and politicians, and if you read it, the same thing in China, and they're extremely self-critical. Few critiques about these socialist experiments are going to be better than the ones that they produce themselves of themselves. So if you're going to engage in comradely critique, I think by necessity, you have to do it in a dialogue with the critiques that they are making of themselves. And that's something that's completely absent from Western Marxism, especially, in my field, the philosophers. They love talking about, the dogmatism and the vulgar character of Soviet philosophy. But look at the citations. Do they cite anyone? Who do they cite? Maybe, dialectical and historical materialism, a small little thing that was done as a very elementary course for recently made literate peasants and workers. I think another good example of this is the way that Che approached criticizing the USSR. When he went to the Eastern Socialist Bloc, he saw that material incentives were being used in order to increase production, and he came up with a critique. And his critique was that we needed to have a more humanistic transformation in people that led them to increase the productive forces out of voluntary work. And this, is conjoined with this project of creating a new socialist man, a new socialist person. And he felt that was fundamental for Cuba. And it was a critique that he wasn't condemning, Eastern socialism for doing those things. It was a comradely critique, and it was something that was that they tried to adjust to the Cuban context. And, I have this story that I often recall of my grandfather. He was involved in the revolutionary struggle in Cuba. He was a seminarian that went into the brigades, that went into El Campo to educate people and to provide medicine. And one of the things that I often ask him, especially having grown up in Miami and the sort of bourgeois culture that you have here, is, why did you work so much? I always heard my grandma complain that he would come home very late working, and parts of the family mess around and say, he was just going out having fun, doing mischievous things. But that wasn't the case. He was actually working. And my question was, why were you working so much if you weren't getting materially compensated for it? And he said, well, because I know that if I'm able to finish this pipe work I'm doing in one area, water is able to get to another area quicker. And, if it's a Friday, those people don't have to wait over the weekend, right? So it was work that was done with consciousness of the social good that was going to take place. So there was something to that critique that Che Guevara gave. Of course, in other areas, certain folks like Domenico Lasordo and Carlos Martinez, which is here, in their work, they've talked about, how making those material incentives be the core of an increase in production could lead at times to absenteeism and to various problems that could fetter the development of the productive forces, amongst other things. But I think it isn't very, it is hard to do, but if you're honest about engaging with the criticisms that they provide themselves, and if you're at your core supportive of these projects, I think it is perfectly possible to engage in constructive criticism.
Thanks, Carlos. Such a good point. Keith, please go ahead if you.
Right. Yeah. Just briefly. Although as the other respondents have said, really this question is so fundamental. It's something that I think has to inform every area of our work, and therefore it really belies a simple answer. But a couple of points I would like to make is that, first of all, we should not start when we look at socialism, and the phrase actually existing socialism is I think used for a reason. We don't start from the perspective that it is somehow perfect or perfectly formed or free from error, free from contradiction, because that wouldn't be materialism, it would be idealism. Therefore, we don't start from that premise. But the premise that I think we should start from is that the workers' state, if we're going to use that term, dictatorship of the proletariat, socialist countries, workers' state, whatever you like, is the highest form of class organization and the highest achievement of the international working class, and therefore the stance of being in support of that project is fundamental. And if one loses sight of that, one goes astray. But one starts from that premise because of what that workers' state actually is. And as I sometimes put it, perhaps a little flippantly, if they get anything right, that's just like bonus, because the most important thing is Sorry,
that was just a minute or so, or a few seconds, Keith, that you somehow got muted. Sorry
about that. Yeah. What I was saying is that if a worker state gets anything right, that's simply a bonus, because it's actually the fact of its existence that is the prerequisite for any achievements in the future. So, I agree with Ken's point that there are contradictions and problems, but for those of us who follow China, the fact Chairman Mao wrote the book on contradictions, so the existence of contradiction is not really an issue. Ken talks about using the formulation critical solidarity. Now, having been lucky enough to speak with Ken many times, I don't disagree with what he means about that, but the actual phrase, I have to say, I don't like, because in the imperialist, when people in the imperialist countries look at the socialist countries or the national liberation movements or the movements of the oppressed, and they talk about critical solidarity, what they generally mean is all criticism and no solidarity. And that I'm not suggesting for one moment that that's Ken's position. Absolutely not the case. But I would have to demarcate myself from that phrase for that reason. Finally, agree with what Carlos said, that the most interesting and the most material criticism of the socialist countries is the self-criticism produced from within those societies themselves. And the example I would give is, if you read, people think about the DPRK, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, and they say, oh, that this is a kind of authoritarian, automaton place, and so on. Just read the articles of Kim Il-sung or the speeches that are coming out very regularly now from Kim Jong-un. You won't find sharper and more concrete self-criticism of the shortcomings in the work of the party and the stage of development of society than you'll find in those. And I think those are models, really.
Great. Now, just so everyone knows, we're going to try and stop at on the hour, wherever you are. So I think we'll take the 3 questions that I see next and then do a round. And I think that should probably take us up to that point. If we have time and if there are any more questions, we will then continue. But otherwise, we will stop at that point. So I have Kim-Eng, Bob Ratner, and John Catalinotto. So Kim, please go ahead.
Okay, my question is the same, to some extent the same that I brought up in the past, in the last IMG discussion, is a lot of people in the United States who wanted what we call a socialist revolution sees the elections as the way to get it. And here we have this discussion about how the Paris, that was the mistake of the Paris Commune. And then the lessons we learned from China is 35 years of civil war and a war against the imperialists, also with the years in which they build up their own, system in Yan'an and all these other Soviets. So they have that experience of building a totally different model. So I'm just saying is that it's prevalent in the United States that we will vote our way into socialism now. How do you tackle that kind of question? Thank you.
Great, thanks. Bob Ratner, please. I think you're still muted, Bob.
Okay. No. I'd like to ask the speakers, especially in advanced modern technological societies, in empirical fact and aspiration, whom do you regard to be members of the working class?
Okay, that's also another important question. And then John, please go ahead.
Yes, you can hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. I think we have to be aware, and maybe the speakers who enjoyed your presentations very much can say something about this. We have ourselves, we're involved in this contradiction of, on the one hand, we want to analyze what's going on and be aware of where there are mistakes made, or even if not mistakes made, not something maybe could have done better to come out with a better result. And yet at the same time, we're part of a worldwide ideological battle that's going on, in which the imperialists have a great advantage, and they will seize upon any differences that they find amongst the progressive forces. And how would you expect us to balance it? I think it's important. It comes through a little bit in a clear way from what the speakers have said in their comments afterwards, in the need to defend in all cases the right of the oppressed classes to use the force of the state apparatus to defend themselves against the imperialists and against the capitalists in their own country, which is often what's under attack in the imperialist media and is tried to be used against them. But I'd like to hear your comments on that too. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Shall we take things in the same order? Ken first and then Carlos and Keith. Ken, please go ahead.
Sure. Oh boy, good questions. Let me just think off the top of my head for a minute about, what do we mean by the working class these days? I mean, in many ways, the fundamental question is always your relationship to the motive, to the means of production, and these days that has gotten increasingly complicated. Obviously, in the United States, we've moved away from, the role that the industrial working class played, decades ago, into this weird gig economy and all that kind of stuff. But there's no question that the vast majority of people don't have are not the owners and controllers of the means of production. So even though someone may not be going through the factory gate, doesn't mean that they're not part of the working class. So I think that my tendency, I guess, would be to conceive of it or to conceptualize it broadly, and not try to come up with some more narrow parameters, but to see that, clearly there are those who own the means of production, and there are those who derive their wealth, their power, their livelihoods from the exploitation of the labor of others, even if that's, having someone, drive your food delivery car, or deliver your food in their own car. I mean, this economy that we find ourselves in, where so many of the functions of capital have been kind of devolved down to the workers themselves, but the value that's created is still being appropriated by, a relatively tiny group. So I think, again, it's sort of a cliche, follow the money. That's really how we can sort that out. And yeah, the question of our critique, and I totally take Keith's point, that all too often the idea of critical support is all criticism and little support. But a lot of the political work that I do these days is through Pivot to Peace and through PSL, is trying to push back against this massive propaganda campaign directed against China. And you can't just say, oh no, none of that is true, everything in China is fine, because everything in China isn't fine. It's mostly fine, but it's a situation where we have to be able to address the questions and the concerns that people have, even as we say, that's a lot of propaganda, that's a lot of corporate media, that's a lot of distortion, demonization. I talk about this stuff every day, but you have to be armed. The Chinese talk about seeking truth from facts. You have to be armed with that, and which is what we do with all these webinars and all these writings that we do and everything. We try to arm ourselves with information, with knowledge, with facts, so that we can push back, not just in a sense of, well, I think it's good, and so let's just go with that, but to say, okay, here's this issue, this is what the corporate media says, this is what the bourgeois mouthpieces say, here's some facts, here's some truth, and have the means to back it up, and it's a challenge, it's an ongoing effort, but it doesn't do to just say everything's hunky-dory, everything is perfect, because it isn't. And the Chinese themselves say that, they're not saying, yeah, we got it down, we're all done, we've achieved socialism. They're very clear. You read Xi Jinping's address, his report to the 20th Party Congress, he lays out the challenges, the contradictions, the problems that they're facing. They acknowledge that, and that's what we need to be able to do, is to nuance that. The difficulty is, and I totally take the point, that obviously the bourgeoisie, they will seize on any difference, any crack in the facade, that they see. We can't stop them from doing that. They're going to do that. So we have to present our critiques, our concerns. We have to be very clear about how we present them in a mode of solidarity, in a mode of, let's figure out how to solve these glitches in the project in which we are all sharing. That's as well as I can do with that.
Great, thanks, Ken. Carlos, please go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, just to piggyback on that, it's also important to add the context, right? Because criticism without context it's not really, it's just criticism. It's not critique. It's not understanding, the factors that led to the fact of a specific mistake or of a specific contradiction. And it tends to be the case that imperialist hybrid warfare is context enough to understand some of the flaws. As far as I do want to get to the question about voting and socialism, I'll hit that one last, but I want to start with the second one about the working class. I think it is important to remember something that Engels says in Anti-Düring, which is definitions are the death of science. That's a very serious statement. We have to take that statement seriously, because what that means is that, when you participate in engaging through the world through these static definitions, you're pulling reality out of the interconnections and dynamism in which it exists in. And the analysis of class that Marx has is always concrete. It's always something that's it's concretizing. So when you think about the working class, the first determination, right, the most abstract level for participation in the working class would be, you don't own the means of production, you're forced to sell your labor power. But from there's a whole host of determinations that are then added. If you read Capital closely enough, you realize that he speaks about different types of proletariats: the agricultural proletariat, the industrial proletariat, the unproductive, the unproductive labor as part of the proletariat, but functioning in a different sort. So that's important to remember, that definitions are not, don't treat them statically. Focus on the development of the world and adjust the definitions in accordance. Now, what has happened to the US? We used to have this large industrial proletariat. In the Communist Party, the tradition of Henry Winston used to call that the front rankers of the socialist struggle. And what's happened is, a phenomenon that Radica and Naled Freeman described very well, which is financialization. The rate of profit has dropped over a whole host of years. The bourgeoisie is presented with two options, either take your capital, your productive capital, elsewhere where you can super exploit labor, or you go through the route of financialization, because it's no longer profitable to develop industry in the US. And that has had a host of effects, one of which has been the destruction of what in the US was called the middle class, right, which was a section of the proletariat that was really living a sort of aristocracy of labor type of existence. It was very comfortable for some years, for some decades. It was able to even accumulate, which is something that Marx talks about the proletariat not being able to do. It was able to accumulate. Of course, there was a reality that was primarily felt by the white part of the working class in the US, but that's all kind of gone rogue over the last 40, 50 years or so, since neoliberalism and this turn towards rampant financialization. And we've developed something that my colleague at the Midwestern Marx Institute, Noah Krashvik, calls reproletarianization, right? This mass of the middle class has now fallen back to a condition of the proletariat. They're not living the same lives that their parents were living. Actually, in the US, we're seeing now the first generation in US history to live lives that are worse than their parents. Not only are they unable to accumulate, but they're in an immense debt slavery. And you know, if you recall in the third volume of Capital, Marx refers to the forms of debt that are put on working people as the secondary form of exploitation, as a second form of exploitation. So that's rampant, whether it's student debt and other forms of debt that's rampant in our working class. So yeah, as far as that's the comment that I wanted to give. I think it was John who gave the third question about, if I'm correct in interpreting your question, it was about the treatment of the media, and how this lapdog media of the imperialist bourgeoisie is able to use any criticism and turn it into divides and create splinters in the working class movement and in the view that's portrayed of other countries, especially the ones that, you know, go on to take more, I guess, radical measures in their transformation of the state. And I would say that, look, they're going to do it anyways. You know, you have a case in Venezuela where, you know, this idiot Guaido is just running around freely, and they're still calling Maduro a dictator. You know, what type of a dictator, when the people come out to beat up Guaido whenever he goes to popular neighborhoods, what type of a dictator sends, you know, the police so that he doesn't get himself killed? And they're still calling him a dictator. So regardless of what they do, they're still going to come down with their propaganda. And it's not ever going to be based in reality. And, you know, it's really going to be up to us at the end of the day to sort of debunk these lies, this atrocity propaganda that's really aimed at, you know, inventing a new reality and manufacturing consent for these proxy wars and hybrid wars against socialist countries. As to the question of voting and socialism, I think that although one can very much say that the objective conditions for revolutions are as ripe as they have been in maybe a century in the US, the consciousness is not very much there. It's at a very embryonic stage. And in terms of thinking about like a violent uprising against the state, I just don't think that's anywhere near the horizon. We are lucky if we can continue the route that we have of emphasizing the labor movement, of returning to a more militant form of labor organizing, and hopefully in delinking the progressive forces from the Democratic Party, which has really just been an engine of sucking in any sort of progressive movement. If we can do that within the next 10 years, maybe if you ask me the question 10 years from now, I can say, well, I can kind of see the workers grabbing arms and doing something. But right now, I just don't think that's in the horizon.
Great, Carlos. Thanks, Keith.
Thanks. I'm going to be brief. Just on this question of the socialist countries, I think that anybody who thinks that everything there is hunky-dory or perfect is you know, among the terminally naive. I don't think that that's the issue. You know, if one looks at the case of China, China itself says that it's in the primary stage of socialism. And for a considerable time, they talked about being not simply in the primary stage of socialism, but of the primary stage of the primary stage. Things have kind of moved on, with Xi Jinping refers to a new era and about building a modern socialist country in all respects by 2049. But this clearly means that this is a work in progress, and you know, with all that implies. So, like I say, I think it's not even about necessarily agreeing or disagreeing with this or that particular policy or action. It's about the solidarity with what people are trying to achieve. On this question that Kim raised about, as I understand it, how do you tackle the idea that we can vote our way into socialism? Well, I think I tried to address some of that in my earlier remarks about the question of not simply taking hold of the existing state. So I don't really want to go over that again. But what I would say is that, again, if one looks at the case of the Chinese Revolution, the millions of people died to establish the People's Republic of China. It was an extremely bloody affair. not quite sure how if this story is 100% accurate, but at the time of the 1989 protests, it's said that Wang Chen, who was then the vice president of the People's Republic of China, is supposed to have said 20 million people gave their lives to establish the People's Republic of China. If anybody is thinking of overthrowing us, they must be prepared to expend at least that same number of lives. And I think that just gives you a sense of the scale of just how just what degree of sacrifice and dedication was what was required. But what follows from that is that people will only go down a road that leads to such a degree of sacrifice, one, out of necessity, and two, if every other option is exhausted. And therefore, this whole question, even though in a sense it keeps coming around, in around 1920, Lenin advised the British communists, not all of whom were very enthusiastic about it, and it's still a question I think that's open to debate. But Lenin advised that British communists should seek membership of the Labour Party, that the Communist Party should seek to affiliate to the Labour Party, which was then much more so than it is now a federal body, and that they should in general terms vote Labour, not because Lenin had any illusions about there being a peaceful parliamentary road to socialism. I think probably Lenin was one of the people in history with the least illusions of that kind, but because Lenin had a profound understanding of the stages and phases through which the proletarian movement must pass, and how the working class had to be brought to an understanding of its historic mission. Therefore, I would say that it is an ongoing process that the working class has to learn the way towards socialism through its own experience, and the idea that it should be done as peacefully as possible is not an unreasonable wish or aspiration, because the violence of the revolutionary process is, to my mind, not something that the proletariat seeks. It's something that the proletariat is faced with because of the resistance and intransigence of the class enemy. So that's it.
Thanks, Keith. That's great. And just on this question, so we do have one more question, so we might just take it. But before we go there, if I may just use my chair's position to say two very quick things. Number one, this whole question of the working class and how to define it. We at the International Manifesto Group have a very brief definition, which goes like this. The working class consists of all those who must work for their living, whether they are employed or not, and whether they are paid for their work or not, which means that includes everyone who is doing unpaid care work, the majority of whom are women. And so I think if we adopted such a definition, things are much easier. Secondly, I think that the whole question of class tends to be a little bit complicated in our times, because we, in addition to all the various ways of dividing working people that we have seen and which we are all familiar with, whether it's by race, gender, skill level, etc., there is also a geographical division of the working class in the following sense, that there is a disproportionate number of intellectual workers in the homelands, imperialist homelands of capitalism, and a disproportionate number of manual workers in the rest of the world. And so the intellectual division between the division between intellectual and manual labor is increasingly taking a geographical form. Hence, you see the dominance of certain postmodernist themes and certain identity politics themes, etc., in Western countries where you have this disproportionate number of intellectual workers who have also played a critical role in pulling historic parties of the working class further to the right. So I just thought I would add that. So I think that's Charles McFadden who has his hand up, although that's not what his name tag says. But please, quickly your question and a quick round of answers, and then we will bring this wonderful session to an end.
Yes,
So,
my problem and hesitation is it's quick, but I need it to briefly, maybe 30 seconds, provide context for the question. The context that my question is raised is the recognition that every government that forms itself as a revolutionary socialist one has the immediate task and ongoing responsibility to see that people are materially provided for. In other words, that economic activity needs to continue. And I think all the countries and examples that we've described or discussed in this process have meant that the revolutionaries have had to participate in a world, especially today, but probably from the beginning, in those cases where revolutions occurred, they had to participate in a capitalist world economics trade system of trade. And it was the only way in which any of these socialist countries could survive. So that's the context. So my question is, might it be better for us to refer to the socialist countries as countries with governments who are committed to socialism, so that we can then understand the dilemmas and problems they face in having to exist within a capitalist world market?
Thanks, Charles. I think all us respondents will agree with you, but will you go in the usual order? Ken, Carlos, and Keith.
Well, yeah, no, I totally agree with that. I actually have a book coming out that's called China's Revolution and the Quest for a Socialist Future, because that's what it is. It's not you don't get a blueprint and you just build it, it is an ongoing struggle, and that's what it's about. They hold the vision, they hold the mission, they hold the task, they grasp the task, I totally take your point. I agree with your point.
Thanks, Carlos.
I do want to hold on to, I like, in Cuba, they use the construction of socialism. Even in Bolivia, the name of the ruling party is Movimiento al Socialismo, movement towards socialism. And I really like that. But I still refer, to these countries as socialists. A lot of them consider themselves to be in the first stages of socialism. And I think referring to them as socialism is important because they are qualitatively different from all capitalist countries around the world, whether they're in the imperialist core or not. There's a qualitative difference at play there. And I think that it could be characterized as socialism in one of the first stages of its global development.
Great, thanks. And Keith.
Yeah, well, I agree with Carlos, although I don't disagree with the questioner. If you look, collectively 5 countries, China, the DPRK, Vietnam, Laos, and Cuba, all collectively consider themselves to constitute the socialist countries. And there are various other countries that we've discussed, Venezuela, Nicaragua, and so on, which at least a few years ago, the Koreans started to refer to them as countries aspiring towards socialism. And before the Soviet Union collapsed, the CPSU had theories of non-capitalist road of development, socialist orientation, and so on. The idea of non-capitalist road of development actually goes back to a talk that Lenin had with a delegation of the Mongolian People's Party in 1920. So it actually has quite a long lineage, and I think it's a very interesting point. But to me, why is it that those 5 countries collectively consider themselves to constitute the socialist countries, although all of them are very supportive of the projects towards socialism in other countries? It's because those are the countries which have succeeded in establishing in one form or another the Dictatorship of the Proletariat, where the working class is institutionally organized as the ruling class, and therefore they have embarked on the road of building socialism. Therefore, when I refer to them as the socialist countries, I don't think that means that they have completed the building of socialism. The level of socialism may be, quite basic and very much as the Chinese say, in the primary stage, or the Vietnamese talk about a socially oriented market economy and so on. But they have made what Carlos just described as that qualitative transformation into another form of society. Therefore, I think it's equally correct as the comrade to put the question, to say that these are countries with governments that are committed to the building of socialism. I think that's in some ways a more precise definition. It's also a less handy definition. But again, I would see a certain distinction in that there are other countries. There are countries like Venezuela, Nicaragua, I would say, for example, Eritrea, which are committed to building socialism, but have not yet made or are yet to make that qualitative transition that the 5 socialist countries have made.
Thanks, Keith. That was really very comprehensive and very thoughtful answer. I think we should bring this event to a close, but let me remind everybody that we have some excellent events coming up. You all will have received the mail out. Hopefully you all received the mail out today. So we have a session on Western media, on the Western media, critique of the Western media manufactures consent for capitalism's disasters. And we have a slew of the most excellent alternative young journalists, including Ben Norton, Li Jingjing, Danny Haifong, Camila Escalante, and KJ No speaking. And then after that, we will have that's next weekend, next Sunday. And then thereafter, we have the Counter Summit for Democracy, which is co-organized with Friends of Socialist China. And that will be on Sunday, the 2nd of April. So please join us for these events. I would like to thank Ken for his wonderful speech, and to Carlos and Keith for their excellent presentations, which could have been speeches in their own right, because I think you all had excellent points to make about the manifesto and its the Commune and its current relevance. So thank you all very much. Thank you to all the members of the audience. Please continue to follow International Manifesto Group. Please also check out Midwestern Marx if you haven't already. And thank you, and until next week. Goodbye.